On this week's show, Russia warns that the USA is getting ready for war in Venezuela, and China says leave Cuba alone. The war hawks are circling. But first, the National Security Agency says make us stop surveilling every phone call made in the USA. What's that about? And what else are whistleblowers warning about? I'm Holland Cook in Washington. This is The Big Picture on RT America. In one of the Jason Bourne movies, a British reporter is identified after speaking the word Blackbriar in a phone call. The film dramatized Uncle Sam keyword scanning every phone call everywhere. The movie is fiction. In fact, the National Security Agency has been collecting metadata on domestic USA phone calls since the aftermath of 9/11. And now the NSA itself is recommending to the White House that it discontinue the program. Why now? Let's ask William Binney, who served 30-plus years at the National Security Agency before retiring in 2001, after which he called for a government investigation of mass data collection the NSA was doing, and he was publicly critical of stepped-up surveillance of American citizens post-9/11. In 2005, he was accused of leaking information that surfaced in a page-one New York Times expose about warrantless NSA eavesdropping. Despite being cleared of wrongdoing, his home was raided at gunpoint by the FBI. How'd that go?
Not pleasant.
Mr. Binney, welcome.
Thank you.
In an interview with Reason Magazine, you explained that the NSA took the program you had created to do social network reconstruction of anybody in the world and directed against everybody in the United States. That means they were basically putting a pen register on every phone in the USA. Pen register being a device that records all the numbers called from a phone line. How has Uncle Sam been surveilling our calls, and why now to stand down?
Well, you see, the point that I can see is that the upstream program of collection of all the data, content and metadata on the fiber lines has progressed to the state where they don't need any of the supplemental data from the companies listing all the phone calls that they had recorded. They used that to fill in the holes they had in missing collection on the upstream program. But the upstream program is really the main one. It's done under Executive Order 12333 with no oversight whatsoever. This is the one that the FBI and the DEA and the CIA interrogate, as well as the Five Eyes. They also interrogate this database for the FBI and DEA. They look for criminal activity inside the U.S., just common crimes, as well as terrorism, of course. They justify it for doing this, say they're doing it for terrorism, but they're not really. They're just doing it for everybody.
Well, they seem to be crying uncle about the volume of data that's being gathered. And does mass data gathering risk info overload?
It does if you do the content. For the metadata, that's not a problem. I mean, the metadata could be stored on racks just on this stand right here, right behind us. That would be for the entire world and have multiple copies of it. So that's not the issue. The issue really is the content. And that's not the program they're talking about. They're talking about the basic one under the Patriot Act, Section 215, where the metadata, the content, the calls, date, time, duration is passed from the companies to NSA to graph and build relationships. That's not the real major program that's in violating our rights. The one that is the upstream one. That's where they're copying not just the content, but also the metadata. So that metadata basically was redundant to what they are talking about in this program.
We say metadata, it's lingo, but essentially it's which number is calling which number and patterns emerge. Yeah. But since 9/11, has anybody actually been listening to my voice when I made a phone call?
There's a potential for that. They have been using, the evidence I've compiled shows they are using translation devices, which means they can buy them by the millions and do millions of calls all the time simultaneously. And they have access to all those phone calls, so they can record them, store them for a certain period of time, scan them with these translation devices, and then scan the translated material using algorithms that score things in terms of phrases and words used. And then if something hits a threshold, they could pass it to a transcriber in Fort Gordon, Georgia. There are a couple thousand of them there. And they can then do a transcript.
What about this beehive thing out in Utah?
Oh, well, that's where the storage is. That's where all the the content, the recordings and things like that are.
You have spoken out suggesting that 9/11 was preventable. Talk about that.
Yeah, it is. It was a clear preventable. All these terrorist attacks are clearly preventable. I mean, look at them. You hear about these terrorist attacks, and then they talk about the perpetrator of the attack, and it was a well-known person that was either declared violence toward the West or something like that, and had already been known to be affiliated with different organizations and they should have been focused on them and watching them. But when they spread their effort over the entire planet, you diffuse any energy you have to find a threat in advance, and so you lose it, and you can't see it coming, and so the attacks happen, and then afterward they come in. NSA does basically. We have all this data on this person. Here's his entire social network. Here's all this information about him. But if they'd have been focusing on them in the beginning, I mean, even the terrorists in 9/11 gave the date of the attack before the attack.
Wow.
So, I mean, it was in the NSA data, but they couldn't get to it.
I remember that early 90s World Trade Center bombing.
93.
Shortly after that, 60 Minutes did a piece and identified Osama bin Laden and said, this guy's a bad guy, keep an eye on him. And we didn't.
Actually, we did. We just didn't watch him closely enough.
Wow.
That network, his entire network was known from 96 on. So,
Is, in your opinion, business as usual at the National Security Agency breaking the law? And if so, how?
A certain part of it is. I mean, there's still a lot of it. A lot of it's devoted to doing the charter that they're allowed to do and chartered to do. That's for foreign intelligence. But the domestic side of it is totally unconstitutional, violating, in my view, the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments of the Constitution. The first, because it shows all of your relationships, and so you don't have free association.
Right.
And the fourth, because they're looking at the content of what you're saying and what you're writing in your emails and so on, and your chatter and short messages and things like that. So that's the Fourth Amendment. Then they use that against you to see if you're going to commit a crime or are in the process of a criminal activity. They'll use that against you in violation of the Fifth Amendment. And then when it comes time to trying you, they can't use that evidence in a court of law because it wasn't acquired with a warrant. So they do a parallel construction.
Right.
That means they send people out to find data using standard policing techniques, and then they substitute that in the court of law to try you and convict you. And I call that a planned, programmed perjury policy run by the Department of Justice of the United States. And it's in total violation of almost all the rights that we have in the Constitution, the major ones anyway.
I think I just learned something, because I had the impression CIA only operated elsewhere and NSA only operated domestically. But NSA does get involved in foreign stuff as well?
Oh, NSA's charter is foreign.
Oh, gotcha.
So is CIA's. But they're all doing domestics in 9/11.
Ouch.
So, and they interrogate the same database without oversight, by the way.
Well, to that point, and as if these agencies themselves weren't a concern, could CIA or NSA contractors with data access run amok?
Absolutely. I mean, look at Edward Snowden, what the access he had. He could do that. I mean, they could look at it for espionage, industrial espionage, for example. All that information is there about the industrial trading and all that, and probably bidding, calculations of bidding being done by other companies is in there somewhere, and they can find that and use that in their bidding for a contract internationally.
Is Snowden a traitor or a patriot?
I think some of the things he took out he shouldn't have, but I think that's part of the problem of collecting data. You know, when you try to find the data that's important to get out to people, most of the stuff that I've seen shows that he's a patriot because he's showing the criminal violations of our Constitution by our own government. I mean, those are under Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, that governs all classification by the U.S. government. They must declassify that because it's evidence of a crime.
If Ben Bradley and Katharine Graham were heroes in the Pentagon Papers instance, why is Julian Assange a villain?
Because they want to get rid of him because they don't want the truth told. That's why.
Most recently, a government whistleblower Protection Office itself is under investigation for retaliating against whistleblowers. President Trump has touted the 2017 Veterans Administration Accountability and Whistleblower Act, saying this bill protects whistleblowers who do the right thing. We want to reward, cherish, and promote the many dedicated employees at the VA. Yet right now, the VA Inspector General is probing misconduct at the senior level. Employees who disclose, for instance, concerns about diminished mental capacity of a doctor treating vets. In another case, a malfunctioning water filtration system. They all say they've suffered retaliation. Is the problem with all these safeguards that the fox is guarding the henhouse?
Primarily, yes. I mean, for example, in our case, the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, where we made our complaint against NSA, was the one who gave our names to the FBI, and that's why they raided us. So, yeah, and it was a wild accusation. The FBI, even at that time they raided us, they knew who was the source of the New York Times material. And they knew we weren't, because they had all the material from the Stellar Wind, which is a domestic collection of data on phone calls, emails, and so on. They knew we had no contact with anybody in the New York Times. They already knew that. So, and they knew who did it. That was Thomas Tam from the Department of Justice, the lawyer who was writing the request for warrants to the FISA court for the DOJ. He could see in there they already had wiretaps and were reading their emails and phone calls and everything.
And they raided you anyway.
And they raided us anyway. So,
William Binney, thank you for your time tonight and for your service.
Thank you.
To our country. Coming up, the hawks are circling Venezuela. Is war imminent? This is The Big Picture on RT America.